Good day, friends and fans of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. My name is Nolan Johnson, occasional guest host on the program. Today, Clay has asked me to invite you to the Lewis and Clark Airstream Journey launch event at Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest in Lynchburg, Virginia at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, May 6th. You'll pay a $26 entrance fee that goes to Poplar Forest, where Clay will make some remarks about Jefferson and Lewis and Clark, and then we'll all have a potluck picnic nearby. This is your opportunity to see the fabled Airstream Rocinante and spend an afternoon with Clay as he begins his transcontinental epic trek. For more information, go to listeningtoamerica.org. On today's episode of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, the future of the public lands, Clay interviews Walt Dabney, who worked for over 30 years in the national park system, including serving as America's chief ranger for 5.5 years in Washington, D.C. Mr. Dabney is lecturing around the country about the threat to public lands for those who would return them to the states or privatize them altogether. Mr. Dabney refutes 3 myths about public lands. First, that the U.S. government has no right to own property. Second, that the U.S. government retains public domain for nefarious reasons. And third, that individual states were promised at the time of their statehood that public land would be deeded over to them. All demonstrably untrue, says Walt Dabney. Although he's worried about current moves to reduce the size of national monuments and allow greater resource extraction on public lands, Mr. Dabney believes that the public will rally to protect and preserve one of the best things about America: our national parks, national monuments, game preserves, wildlife refuges, and national forests. We appreciate Mr. Dabney taking the time out to be on the program this week. We'll head on over to Clay. Let's go to the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and I have the honor of sitting virtually, at least, across from Walt Dabney. Walt Dabney has credentials to talk about the public lands that nobody else probably has. Been in park management and the Park Service for 30 years, a naturalist at Old Faithful, one of your first NPS jobs, has worked at Yosemite, Mount Rainier, the Grand Tetons, even the Everglades. For 5.5 years, the chief ranger of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., during which Yellowstone burned. Everyone who's old enough remembers that extraordinary moment in American life. For 11.5 years, managed Texas state parks, such as they are, retired to Austin, and then to Moab, and now to Buena Vista, Colorado. Welcome, Walt.
Thanks much, Clay. Great to be with you.
I hope I didn't miss anything there. What an extraordinary career you have had in both state and federal management of our public lands.
You know, Clay, it was great, and I wish I could do it again, but it doesn't work that way.
We need you now more than ever. So one of the things you said in this lecture that Canyonlands National Park has had produced and has released is that, quote, I'm quoting you, it would be an irreversible tragedy to transfer public lands out of public ownership. It's a point you make 2 or 3 times in that hour-long lecture. It would be an irreversible tragedy to transfer public lands out of public ownership. Tell us why.
Well, right now, the lands that we call the public lands, and they're managed primarily by the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, or the National Park Service, certainly U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuges. That's what is left of the lands that we all have owned in common from the time we obtained them. As this country was settled from east to west, and you had programs like the Homestead Act, and the government was selling land to raise money, mostly at $1 or $1.25 an acre, and we paid the railroads to do it. By the time we got all the way to the west, the lands that were usable for agriculture, which is what we were using them for, had been homesteaded or sold and were occupied by private individuals. That's how those lands that we all owned in common were transferred by Congress to the people to private ownership. In 1976, Congress said, we're not going to do that anymore. And so what we have left over are more arid lands. They're the beautiful landscape, but they weren't very usable or not usable at all for agriculture. So now the public lands are mostly in the West because, not remarkably, it was settled east to west. And so now those have been designated as national forests or national parks, mostly by either presidential proclamation and or act of Congress, and turned into those different kinds of categories. And the ones that are not designated are in BLM. Well, those lands today are still used for multiple use, and in multiple use timber, oil and gas, hard rock minerals, whatever it is.
Recreation.
Recreation is an absolutely, probably maybe one of the biggest now in actual financial dollars, are used all the time. And the states actually get half of the federal revenue basically that's generated on those lands now that we all own. And right now, Clay, I moved back from Texas after my gig as the director down there to the West because Texas doesn't have any public land. And I am a serious, even as an old guy, I'm a serious public land user. I've hunted and fished all my life. I'm a mountain biker. I'm a hiker. I even still get up some big mountains and trying to act like I'm not old.
You said, I want to address in this conversation we're having some of the myths about the public lands. And so the first one is that somehow the federal government is holding back these lands because it loves to own land. But you just said almost every acre of the public domain that could be used for agriculture or some other economic use has been privatized and deeded over in the course of American history. That the public lands that we have, 28% of the United States, are largely lands that either couldn't produce a farm or have been deeded back after they were lost during the Depression and so on. That it's an absolute falsehood that the federal government sort of has some sort of greed to hold on to public land.
That is absolutely true. And when you say a lot of these lands are still used for oil and gas production, even coal mining and that kind of thing.
Multiple uses.
Multiple use. As I talk about in that program, we could do a lot better with that if Congress would let us run that like a business and charge the same thing, for example, that the states do in those same locations for the same land. But that's an entirely different thing. The lands that are left over are now still used for multiple use, but this whole segment of outdoor recreation has absolutely exploded. You just think one of the things that we're going to really, I hope, not experience as badly as it might be, this cutting the staff in all the national parks. These places that are national parks or state parks are mostly located in rural parts of America. And they bring people to those rural parts of America that would not be coming otherwise. I'll give you a perfect example. The population of Grand County, Utah, which is where Moab is 9,700 people. Do you know what the annual visitation to the Grand Canyon or Grand County, Utah is? It's right at 3 million people.
So 70, almost under 8,000 permanent residents, but almost 3 million people come every year to enjoy Canyonlands, Arches, all the great monuments there.
And the public lands, the forest and the BLM. When I made that program that you watched earlier on, that was being presented to about 180 guides and outfitters that make their living every day on those public lands. And that doesn't count all of us that have the ability to go out and use those lands to hunt and fish and camp and mountain bike and river run and all the things that we love to do that you cannot do in a lot of other places.
Yeah, so myth number one, the U.S. government sort of has agreed to hang on to these lands and for irrational reasons wants to hold them. Simply not true. Myth number two, that the states were promised upon entry into the Union that the lands would be given back to them. And you spend a fair amount of time at the beginning of your lecture saying that's just not true. The Constitution itself allows the government to own land, and the enabling acts that brought states into the Union explicitly said that the states would not control lands that were part of the public domain.
That is absolutely true, Clay. And when I put this program together, it was in part a result of people saying, well, and I was in Utah, we want our lands back. And I was thinking, they never were, I don't think. So I started researching it. When Brigham Young came into the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, you know where he was coming into? He was coming into Mexico. It was not even the United States. They came into Mexico. It wasn't until 1848 that we got that land from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it wasn't for another 48 years that Utah was eventually carved out of the federal estate and given to them. And
1896.
In 1896. And what the Utah Statehood Act says in Section 3, Part 2, that the people inhabiting said proposed state, do agree and declare they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof. That is not ambiguous.
That seems pretty straightforward, that they are forever barred from having those public lands released to them, except if the Congress of the United States chooses to do that.
That's correct. The next section 12 says the state of Utah, the said state of Utah, shall not be entitled to any further or other grant of land for any purpose than is expressly provided in this act. And so when they say they were promised its statehood, Clay, that is simply factually not true. It says just the opposite in their constitution.
Walt Dabney, let me ask you this question. I hear this all the time. I spent a lot of time in the American West. I talk to these people, sort of loosely called the Sagebrush Rebellion, but I talk to such people. They're good people. They manage their ranches and farms well. They pay their taxes. They're good Americans, law-abiding, and yet they invariably tell me that there was a promise, or at least an implied promise, that once those states got up and running, the federal lands would be deeded back to them. Where does that come from? If it's obviously wrong, you just showed that it's palpably false. Why do they persist in saying this? Are they saying it honestly, or are they making it up?
You know, Clay, I don't even know that. I don't know. I wouldn't attribute a motive to it. That's not useful to me. Well, they want these lands transferred. And if they were transferred, the thing that they really don't understand is there's no way an individual state could possibly pay to manage them. I mean, you think of transferring, say, Utah. Utah's got a total population of 3.3 million people. The public lands are now paid for by 335 million of us from a tax base.
All Americans.
All Americans. Wyoming, the legislature just passed a resolution to transfer everything in Wyoming except for Yellowstone to Wyoming State. You know how many people in Wyoming?
Under 500,000.
600,000 people total. I mean, one fire season, Clay, and they'd be selling them. And they'd be selling them to the highest bidder. And that would not be me, maybe you, but it wouldn't be me. And they would be gone. The things that make us so excited about living in the West would not be available to us anymore. And why would any of us agree for our state or for some other state to get the lands that we all own in common and can use? I can go to Wyoming and not be trespassing because I'm on lands that we all own. We're all public land owners, and a lot of us are public land users regularly.
All right, so the second myth is that there was a promise, real or implied, that the public lands would be deeded back to the states. You've shown that that's simply not true. The third myth is one that I hear almost every day of my life, Walt, that the U.S. government and the Constitution of the United States do not authorize the government to own land.
And again, as I tell people when I do my talk, if you really want to know, I said, first of all, I will not put anything forward to you that I don't know is absolutely true, factually and historically. And you can look everything up yourself. And I encourage you to do that. For example, what does the Constitution really say? All you got to do is go in there and in the Constitution, read Article 4, Section 3, which is the property clause.
Read it to us.
The Congress shall have the power to dispose of and to make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any authority of the United States. So it says unequivocally, the federal government can own property and territory, and they make all needful rules and regulations. So in the case of the Federal Land Policy Management Act passed in 1976, they made that law that they're not going to part with any more land. They made the Homestead Act, which set up the criteria that transferred 270 million acres of that land to the public. That's entirely in Congress's hands. And that's probably part of the reason why the Supreme Court sent that Utah case back to.
Well, we need to take a break. I'm having the great pleasure of talking with Walt Dabney, who spent his career managing public lands both in the state of Texas, but more often for the National Park Service. Your first gig for the NPS was at Yellowstone, and you show in your lecture a fabulous photograph of Old Faithful taken right at the beginning during the Hayden expedition of 1871. We'll be back in a minute. I have so many more questions for you. We're listening to a special edition of Listening to America with Walt Dabney. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I have the real joy and honor of talking with Walt Dabney, who has given his career to the management of public lands. And what struck me in listening to a lecture that's now easily available on YouTube, and we'll post that on our site, ltamerica.org, is that you said it would be an irreversible tragedy to privatize the public lands. So we've gone through some of the myths of all of this, that the government shouldn't own public land, that the government is greedy about public lands, that the states were promised that the lands would be turned back. This is a strong movement that's been going on for a long time, Walt. Because of the election of Donald Trump, there is a greater chance that some of this would happen now than if it were a Democratic administration. We know from Project 2025 and other sources that there is a great desire to reduce the size of some of our national monuments and perhaps eliminate some, to allow greater mineral extraction in the public lands, including possibly in the national parks, to privatize some of the public lands, to especially BLM lands and lower tier lands in the national public domain. How serious a threat do you think this movement is at the present time?
I think, Clay, it's well funded, and there are people that are literally working every day. I've often tried to figure out what their end game is, because there's no way any given state could afford to take care of these places. So they're going to have to part with them. And when Utah passed the Transfer of Public Lands Act in 2012, which is a state act, not binding on the federal government, it said transfer virtually everything in Utah to the state of Utah from the federal government, which means that we all own it in common. And it would become state property, and the state could keep it or sell it. Well, if they sold it, it's gone. We'll never get it back. Never get it back. You know what? Going back just one, there's another piece of statehood acts, and anybody that wants to know what was agreed to related to federal lands, public lands, when they became a state, go read your statehood act. And it says in there, that's not magic. Just go read it. And you can find out exactly what the states were given and what they were told, what they agreed to at statehood. There's a third section related to public lands that somebody hit me with at a talk the other day and said, this is what actually says the federal government is going to give us these lands. And what they pointed to is a section that I'll paraphrase, because I'll paraphrase. And that says that subsequent to statehood, subsequent to the establishment of Utah in 1896 as a statehood, any federal lands that are sold in that state, the net proceeds, 5% of that would go to the state and 95% goes to the federal government. But the bottom line is those lands are now gone. They're not ours anymore. They're gone to some private entity, probably a very wealthy, huge landowner. and we have no access to them anymore. That's just clear as a bell to me. Again, I'm not an attorney, but that's how I read that. And then the rest of your question there, Clay.
The question is about how big a threat is this? That if Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the people, the well-funded, smart, yes, extremely active people who are behind this privatization movement got their way, they would decimate the public lands, including some of our national parks and national monuments. How likely are they to get away with some of this, do you think?
Well, a couple of answers to that. One is that's one of the reasons I'm on the road giving this talk is people need to know what is the truth about their lands. These aren't federal lands, they're our lands. I mean, they belong to us. They're managed by the federal government because no entity could do it otherwise. But they're our lands. And these folks will tell you they were promised at statehood that these lands would be transferred to them after they became a state. That's simply not true, but that doesn't seem to bother them that is not a true statement. And if they're telling people that don't know, well, golly, if the federal government promised that, then they ought to need to do it. But they didn't promise that. So that's not true. They're very serious about this. They're going to try. My guess is that since the Supreme Court sent that back, part of the reason was it was not an emergency. You don't go directly to the Supreme Court without going through district and court of appeals, that they're going to start doing that. But Utah is spending a huge amount of Utah tax money to pursue this goal to transfer these lands for what purpose? What purpose? Because they'll no longer be all of ours. They'll belong to the state of Utah to do whatever they want with them. So I think the threat is real. But the bottom line, Clay, is the only way this can, in theory, legally happen is if the Congress of the United States agrees to it. And that's why the people that are listening to this broadcast or looking at this video, when they ask me, what can we do about this? You make damn sure your delegation knows you want nothing to do with these lands being transferred. And the good part about this, Clay, to me, is that if you're everything from a firewood collector to a hunter to a fisherman to a horseback pack horse user to a hiker to a camper to a mountain biker, and you use these public lands, you're from every possible political persuasion. This has got nothing to do with whether we're a Democrat or Republican or something else. It has to do with whether we use and love these lands that we own together.
Well, you're doing everything in your power to get the word out, and that film, which is widely available, of you lecturing about this at Canyonlands in Moab, is an extraordinary document where people can learn a great deal about the history of public lands and the threat to public lands in the United States. There's a couple of things about that, Walt. First of all, as you well know, Donald Trump has a very friendly Congress. The Republicans in Congress dominate both houses. They've shown no capacity to stand up to him so far. He gets more or less what he wants by persuasions of different sorts, often bullying and threats. So it's not as if there's a check in the Congress of the United States.
I think there is.
What is it?
I think there is, because I'll give you an example that's current right now. There is a bill introduced, I think it's introduced into the House of Representatives by Gabe Vasquez, a Democratic congressman from New Mexico, and the co-sponsor of that, and maybe the lead on that bill, is Ryan Zinke.
Which is amazing if you think about it.
Well, I called Washington and I said, this reads well. The name of the bill is Keep Public Lands in Public Hands Act. And when you read it and reread it, I kept looking for where is the sinister piece of this. And so I called and talked to the legislative aide in Vasquez's office, and she said, no, this is real. That bill is a real deal. That's a very conservative Republican congressman in a bright red state. And the people in places like Montana, places like that, they use and love those lands every day. They make their living as outfitters and guides and stuff on those public lands. And I think they're going to rise up. So I don't think every Republican by far, and Republican congressmen, people from the West, from the East, their constituents don't want those lands to go away from them. So I think unlike some of these bills that are strict party line fights, I don't think the public lands are one of them, because again, once they're gone, Clay, they are forever gone.
I'm talking with Walt Dabney, who had a distinguished career managing public lands, mostly in the national park system, but also in the state of Texas for 11 and a half years. You said some astonishing things in your lecture that's available on YouTube. $862 billion per year for outdoor recreation in America. That's almost $1 trillion per year. You also quote a number of people when these parks were being formed, or national monuments were being designated, or national forests were being designated, local politicians who said, this will destroy Utah. No one will ever come here again. This takes lands off the tax base. This is a disaster. We shouldn't do this. This is the death of Wyoming. And in every case, they've been proved wrong again and again and again and again, that when you designate these things, it's economic advantage rather than deprivation.
That's absolutely true. When Yellowstone was established, they said, that's the end of Bozeman. There'll be no more Bozeman.
Oh, Bozeman. Go to Bozeman today.
Yeah, well, they said when Rockefeller helped set up Grand Teton Park, and it became a national monument, that would make Jackson, Wyoming a ghost town. Have you been to the ghost town of Jackson and tried to find a parking spot?
Or get a restaurant reservation?
Yeah, I mean, they're completely wrong. And try to take those places away now. They wouldn't do it. You know, when they shut the government down the first time in the 90s, the governor of Arizona sent the National Guard and state park rangers to the gates of Grand Canyon. And a friend of mine met them out there and said, what are you doing? Well, we're coming in here to take over this park. No, you're not. What is this all about? Well, the bottom line, Clay, is it was losing Arizona millions of dollars a day because people couldn't come in there. So Arizona ended up agreeing to pay to keep it open until we stopped that foolishness of the government shutdown. And the only reason for that was, and they fought establishment of that park to the point that Teddy Roosevelt had to eventually set it aside as a national monument.
In 1908, with the largest of the national monuments to that point, 800,000 acres. And of course, as you say in your lecture, many of these national monument designations were sort of holding patterns, and these properties would later be transferred into the national park system itself.
That's absolutely true. In fact, in Utah, the five national parks in Utah, 4 of them were established as national monuments first by presidential proclamation.
I want to talk with that after a break, but before we go to break, I want to ask you this question. So we're talking about the economics of it, and it's not my favorite way to talk about it, but I know it's important. So if you transferred these public lands back to the states, you make the point in your lecture that it would be staggering, ruinously expensive for the states to try to do fire protection and management of these lands and all the things that have to be done. Meanwhile, you would lose all that revenue that comes from people coming to those places. And so from the point of view of balancing the budget in the state of Wyoming or in the state of Montana or the state of Utah, it would be an economic disaster to privatize these lands.
Well, I think it would, because they're going to have to put in a staff. And I've got the figures on what it was in 2018 for those agencies in Utah, for example, to do it, but you can do the same thing in any other state. By the time you figure out what the staff cost for the Forest Service, for the BLM, for national park units in that site, and then you figure a fire season on Forest Service land and BLM land, if the state had to absorb that. And then you look at the revenue sharing potential. In 2018, when I got to thinking, okay, say they do transfer these lands, if just for the sake of the discussion, if they were transferred to Utah, what would Utah have to generate to just break even? The number in 2018 was $406 million before
Just
they
to
made
break even on management of those properties.
to do it at exactly the level they've been done, which were understaffed. You know, the National Park Service staffing is about the same as it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. It's inadequate. The visitation to the national park system has absolutely exploded. So they already can't do a lot of the things that they have historically been able to do, and like the hikes and walks and evening programs and things like that are a hallmark, have had to be cut back down. Tours cut back down.
And so even before all of this, before the election of President Trump, the national public domain was radically understaffed. There was delayed maintenance. There were so many things that needed to be taken care of, and Congress has been sort of unwilling to pony up the money that the system needs. Now, if you go in and you eliminate 1 in 5 jobs or 1 in 12 jobs in the system, you're not only starving the system and denying the public those services, but you're endangering the safety and health of those parks, aren't you?
And the visitors to those parks, and the visitors. So you just take Arches. We lose every year 2 or 3 people, often kids or older people, that lose themselves out there in Arches National Park. If you don't have lots of water, it is a matter of hours before you're down and can't get up, and you can't do anything. And so if there's nobody there to come look for you immediately, there's going to be more of that. And I was in the rescue business for years, Clay. I mean, we are the first line. These are isolated places. If you can't do the first responder thing, I was an EMT as well. If we couldn't stabilize somebody and at least get them ready to carry out or fly out with a helicopter, they weren't going to make it.
Now, in addition to that, I mean, if you reduce the staff at national parks, there's going to be hunting, poaching, there's going to be pot hunting, there's going to be vandalism. People are going to pick up petrified rocks and other curiosities. In other words, we barely have enough staff now to protect the parks from stupid uses and extractive uses by private individuals or entities. Imagine if there were no rangers out there at all.
You know, when Yellowstone was first established, they couldn't get it staffed because Congress wouldn't pass. They sent the Army in there. And the only reason it wasn't completely looted from poaching and from timber theft and from all kinds of other issues is the Army stopped that. And so if there's not a presence there, people are going to do what they want. And there's an element of the population that could do a lot of damage quickly.
Well, Dabney, we need to take another break. I'm so interested in this conversation. I have many more questions to ask. We'll be back in a moment. This is a special edition of Listening to America. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this very special edition of Listening to America. I have such a joy in talking with Walt Dabney. He gave his career to management of the public lands, mostly federal. His first gig for the National Park Service was at Old Faithful. What a great start, sir. So I'm going to ask you some sort of rapid fire questions here because I'm so interested. So number one, I have a slight bone to pick with you in your lecture. I'm a Roosevelt scholar, and you do praise Roosevelt and say he can't be overpraised for his work. He set aside 230 million acres of the public domain as National Wildlife Refuge, National Park, National Monument, National Game Preserve, National Forest. It's impossible to exaggerate Roosevelt's role, but you have him boxing with Pinchot in the basement of the White House. And I know he did that, but I think that he deserves a little more praise for the genius of Roosevelt. Here's this New York man born with a silver spoon in his mouth, an invalid, who his doctors thought would probably not live to be an adult. His father challenged him at the age of 12 and said, "You must make your body." If ever anyone took that seriously, it was Roosevelt. He became the very exemplar of the strenuous life, and he went out to the Badlands in 1883 to ranch in western North Dakota. It changed his life. It changed America. It's so important that Roosevelt gets the full credit he deserves for being maybe the most important person in the history of the public lands after the Continental Congress.
Well, I can't argue with you, Clay. and I've had people tell me you spend too much time on Roosevelt.
No.
And I said no. And if you look at the entire Roosevelt, there's a lot of things that we probably wouldn't like about.
We cringe a little about some of it.
Yeah, we cringe a little about some of it. The presentation is fairly lengthy, and I think if Roosevelt hadn't been there after McKinley's assassination, what we know today, which is the point I was trying to make, and I think did, what we know today would not be there. We owe him so much. I mean, I'm sorry about the assassination in any case, but man, having him as the vice president and moving into that and not the least bit intimidated by big business interests that fought him every step of the way.
Absolutely. At the Grand Canyon in 1903, he said, "Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." It doesn't get any better than that, Walt.
It does not.
All right. So the other person I'm certainly not criticizing your lecture. It's outstanding, and I urge everyone to watch it. And I know you're on the road giving it, and you're getting calls to give it in other places. You're becoming an evangelist for the protection of our public lands. Have been all your life, but now you're explicitly in retirement, going on the road, giving these lectures, for which we all owe you a deep debt of gratitude. The other name that I thought would come up or might come up sometime is John Lacey. Without John Lacey, a lot of this wouldn't have happened, particularly Yellowstone.
Yes. Where do you stop? I've had people say you need to put this in a format that you can give to a Rotary Club meeting. I got invited to come to St. George, Utah sometime back to give this talk, believe it or not, to UAC, which is the Utah Association of Counties, which is all the county commissions in the state of Utah. We've carved out 15 minutes for you to do this talk. And I said, I really appreciate the invitation. I would love to talk to them. I can't even introduce it in 15 minutes. This is too big a topic, and there's too many important pieces to it. And they said, well, how much do you need? I said, I need an hour to give this presentation, and that won't give a lot of time for questions. And she called back in 4 days and said, okay, we're going to do it.
Fantastic.
And so when Mark Finley put the video together, I asked him, I said, Mark, you're a historian. What do we cut out to make this shorter? And he said, let me go back and look. And he went and looked, and he said, we could clip off 10 seconds here or 8 seconds over here. He said, when you cut much more out of that, you lose a whole lot out of the story. And so.
Yeah, no question. So let me ask you a question about the national monuments. So the National Antiquities Act, passed in 1906, signed by President Theodore Roosevelt, who was a great advocate for it. He then went on to designate the first 18 national monuments, beginning with his beloved Devil's Tower in Wyoming and culminating almost with Grand Canyon National Monument in 1908. The act gives the president sort of unitary power with his pen alone to designate national monuments, and we have a lot of them. They're fabulous. The critics of this system say two things. Number one, how many national monuments do we need? Haven't we got enough? I mean, for goodness sakes, every president has designated them. They just keep on coming. Enough already. Haven't we really protected the things that most need to be protected? That's argument number one. And number two, that may have worked back then, but now to give a president such unitary authority is not good. Congress should play a significant role in the determination of these things. So those two arguments I'd like you to address. Well,
first of all, if they hadn't had the power in the Forest Reserve Act in the first place, we wouldn't have the National Forest System.
Right.
When I started putting this talk together, Clay, I didn't even know about the Forest Reserve Act of 1881. And then the Antiquities Act, had it not been for that, a whole lot of these places that we enjoy today as national parks and monuments, but national parks would not exist. Almost invariably, locals have opposed these places. They opposed the Grand Canyon. They opposed Yellowstone. They opposed Tetons. They opposed Olympic. They opposed Petrified Forest. They were wrong. In fact, their descendants now that make their money in those same locations would absolutely fight you to the end to protect those places now.
Well, how much is enough? How many more do we need? That's the argument of the conservatives. How many more do we have to have here?
How big should the population in America be? It's not diminishing any. We're at 335 million people now, and it keeps going. That if you look at a lot of these places that people are going, they're waiting lines to get in. We're having to put reservation systems in. In my opinion, there doesn't seem to be a need for fewer places that are special to go to. If anything, we need to generate more, and especially I think on state levels, we need that to happen. And the other thing, go back to this economic deal. These are just giving us more opportunities to capitalize locally, especially on the economic value of these places to people. So I don't know how many more. If it is truly worthy of designation, then do it.
Well, let me change the subject for a moment. I want to ask you about being the chief ranger of the National Park System when Yellowstone burned. I was alive then. I remember the fires, and I remember the governor of Idaho.
Secretary Andrus, Andrus sent myself and 20 other rangers to Alaska in 1979 after President Carter proclaimed the national monuments up there. That's a whole different topic. It was an amazing adventure, pretty crazy. But he got on Nightline with me during the Yellowstone fires. Ted Koppel had us on there, and I was trying to explain what was going on in Yellowstone. And he had his former secretary, Andrus, at that time, he said, well, Koppel said, well, Secretary, what do you think about that? And he said, well, this would have never happened if I was there because I wouldn't have allowed that kind of policy. I hated to be put in that position, but Koppel then said, Ranger Dabney, what do you say about that? And I said, sir, that policy was established in 1972. It had been going for 32 years when the fires started, so it was exactly the same policy when the secretary was there. And the thing about Yellowstone, first of all, fire is amoral. It isn't positive or negative. It's not good for some things. It's outstanding for other things, but it is what it is. It's going to happen. And it'll either happen when you are hopefully dealing with it in a way that you have some control of it, or it's going to happen when you have no ability to control it. You get a very dry time, and you get dry lightning storms coming through with wind, and the fire starts. And in the case of the Yellowstone fires, they had been burning for a month and a half before the big fire started. And the winds and the dry lightning started. The wind picked that fire off the floor, ran it into the crowns, and then would run it through the crowns until the wind died down. And sometimes that was 20,000 acres in a single burning day. And you can't put that out. You can't put fire crews in front of that kind of thing. It's like these people that we're talking about, the California fires. You can't put fire crews and apparatus in front of something that's running before a 60 or 70 mile an hour wind. All you're going to do is kill people. You're not going to influence the fire. We spent a lot of money in Yellowstone that summer. We probably made 10,000 acres worth of difference in fighting that fire, and the snow put it out when the snow was ready.
This must have been a very heady time in your career. I mean, this must have been an extraordinary period when you were the principal ranger of the country and had to face all this.
I loved it. I absolutely loved it because, you know, if you have some notion about what you're talking about, and I loved walking into a congressional hearing in my uniform and setting my flat hat on the desk there. And it was amazing how they would attack somebody in a suit. I could calmly explain to them what was going on and why we could not put it out. and why it wasn't going to be put out. We were trying not to kill firefighters, and we were protecting those historic structures like the Old Faithful Inn and things in Yellowstone that we lost very few of. We couldn't put it out.
Wouldn't attack someone in a uniform. I love that. Thank you. Organic Act, the military in Yellowstone.
Yeah.
When the transition came to a civilian corps, they took on some little echoes of the military costuming, and it continues to this day. It's a fascinating subject. Let me turn to a different subject for a moment. We haven't talked about Native Americans. A lot of the national parks and national monuments were carved out of sovereign lands of Native Americans. We know that now. We didn't really know that 50 years ago, although it was there to be known. What should we do about this problem that there was so much violation of American Indian sovereignty and the creation of some of our best loved national parks and monuments?
I don't know the answer to that, Clay. I really don't. And if there are things that we need to do now, which I think is true of a whole lot of the issues facing us, I would set down a bipartisan, varied background of people. I like to fix things. I would just pull a group together that have any expertise or ideas and come out of that in a month and say, here's some suggested solutions that would be fair and would work. And we can't seem to do that. And almost any of these are addressable if we would sit down and get the right people in the group and really work things through. I mean, is there gonna be some give and take? Hell yes, there's gonna be some give and take, but you're gonna come out with a good product at the end. I think there is a role that needs to be much more collaboration and paying attention to any interested party, and certainly Native American people who have a tie to that piece of land, in a framework that makes you really take into consideration, in addition to NEPA and all the other things, the concerns of Native peoples and a reasonable and logical accommodation of those interests. But co-management is a really difficult thing. That's having a co-boss.
We're loving the national parks to death. I was turned away from Glacier last summer. If a bear is sighted half a mile away in Yellowstone, it creates a traffic jam that rangers have to come and try to break up. It can last hours. I hate the idea of timed entries and reservations and so on, but what's the answer to this?
I worked with that a lot at Arches. When I was there as superintendent for 8 years for Arches and Canyonlands. I don't see another thing. There's a lot of people that come forward with, well, just do a shuttle system. Do you know what the logistics of establishing a shuttle system, taking care of all those buses, staffing those buses in a place that has no housing? And what do you do when people get on those shuttle buses and it's 100 degrees outside and they don't get off? And you got a family stuck at Delicate Arch parking lot that can't get on the bus in 100 degrees because nobody's getting off. There's all kinds of logistics. The best way in any destination around the world, you want to go to the Caves of Lascaux and go to that thing, you're going to have to get a reservation. And people understand that. And we're going to have to do it. The alternative to that, the politics right now may cause them to have to abandon the timed entry thing at Arches. There's local political pressure to do that, and the governor's jumping in that. That's going to be an absolute cluster, to be honest with you. People that have to sit in line for 2 or 3 hours to get in a park with their engines idling and the kids are screaming and all that, that is not a good thing. When I was in D.C. as chief ranger, I got complaints all the time about people who said, we stood in line waiting to get a tour of the White House. And after being in line for an hour and a half, a ranger came walking down the line and said, sorry, folks, you're going to have to try again tomorrow. We're all booked for today's tours. And they said, if you'd have just told us, if we could have had a reservation, we could have done all kinds of other things and then come back at 2:00 for our tour. but we stood in line and just wasted half our day. Well, it's the same thing on a bigger scale.
Let me close with this. I'm so sorry. Let's talk again. I've so enjoyed this. There's so much more to talk about, Walt Dabney. You're now on a kind of crusade. You are a hot commodity, partly because of the crisis of privatization that's circulating through the public lands conversation. This matters to you so much that you're willing, not for personal aggrandizement, but because you want to get the word out. Talk about the crusade that you're on here.
Well, I started this, like I said, when I moved back from Texas, because I moved back here because I could load my mountain bike on and in 10 minutes to be on the greatest trail system, or I could jump in my truck and take my muzzle loader up in the LaSalle's, and during hunting season, if I drew out for something, and I could take off and walk till I couldn't walk anymore, and I'll be on our land. And so I get back there, and people are saying, we want our lands back. These lands are locked up by the federal government. And so I put this program together, and the first presentation was to a chapter of the League of Women Voters at the library in Moab, and it went really well. And it has evolved since that over the last 8 years. And people from the audience would say, well, what about this? And I went, I had not thought about that. And am going to research that, and I'm going to add it to this program. So it has evolved, Clay. And I've now done it, I don't know how many times, dozens and dozens and dozens in at least 12 or 13 states. The more diverse group, the better. People say, well, do you talk to four-wheel drive groups? I said, hell yes. Of course, if these lands go away, they got no place to go. And they're perfectly legitimate public land users, and most of them do a great job of staying on roads and trails, just like most mountain bikers stay on the trails. And they know that if these go away, they got no place to go. So I'm just trying to get the word out to these groups who have an interest and love of these lands and use them, and just say, hey, be vigilant. There is a threat on the horizon that's very serious, and you need to protect your land.
Walt Dabney, so extraordinary. Thank you again. From your talk that people can see on YouTube, it would be an irreversible tragedy to transfer these public lands out of public ownership. Thanks so much. We'll talk again. To all the rest of you, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.